Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Santiago Caro Wash Process Colombia from Black and White Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Black and White, based out of Wake Forest, North Carolina. And they're a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel numerous times before, including most recently in our most recent coffee roaster tier list, where they did finish around the middle of that tier list. And that's something I did get a lot of feedback on, as there's so many people that felt that they were underrated in the tier list. And that's something I can definitely understand, as once upon a time, Black and White used to be one of my 5 favorite American coffee roasters, due to the fact that they were one of the more progressive and innovative coffee roasters in the United States. However, it's for that exact same reason that I haven't been as big a fan of their coffees more recently, as that meant that they've offered a lot more experimental coffees. So I have kept an eye on what they have been offering, and this one is one that definitely caught my interest, as it is the Cheiroso variety, which is a variety I've heard so many people discuss this year. It's been a fan favorite of so many people, and it's a coffee that I've had an opportunity to try as well this year, as Say has offered a couple of those coffees, but I haven't done a full bag review of it yet. So when I saw Black and White carrying it, it felt like a perfect opportunity to return to Black and White and review this variety at the same time. So I'm looking forward to discussing both, as this right here is day 25. And Black and White does have a brew guide on their website. It is, funny enough, the same as our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio. And they suggest between 195 degrees Fahrenheit and 205 degrees Fahrenheit. I like the warmer temperatures, and 205 seemed to work best for me with this coffee, so 205 is what we went with. And we went with the V60 for this coffee, as I definitely liked it more through that brew method. Roast profile is interesting. They have it listed on here as a light medium. However, this coffee, interestingly, at times acted even more developed than that, so I could say that it was kind of pushing towards that more developed side of that light medium, even sometimes pushing a little bit more of a medium in general. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 7, first impression, and this is somewhat of what I was alluding to, as it came out a little bit more robust than initially expected. And I didn't think it was Black and White, because I don't remember Black and White ever being a more developed coffee roaster. I just honestly felt that it was this coffee specifically, as it did come out a little smoky. It could have been some of these slightly more caramelized aspects to the cup, as there was also a sharp acidity that was kind of contrasting that more robust characteristic to it. Cup felt a little bit zesty with a slight citric aspect to it as well. It left an interesting first impression, and I thought, okay, maybe just give this coffee a little bit of time to settle, because this was a little bit more strange of a first impression, but it was still a good, interesting first try. Day 9, still a little bit more robust of a cup, as it really does lean into the contrasting characteristics of a bright tart citrus, as well as this more dark and robust caramel. And when I'm referring to that dark, robust characteristic, it did feel a little smoky yet again on this day. It's a little complex, but it definitely opens up and improves a lot as it does cool down, as you're able to get a little bit more of this sweeter citric aspect to the coffee. Day 11, cup continues to be somewhat inconsistent to this point, as there is a slight increase in the vibrancy as a whole. It really leaves this lingering citrus finish in the cup, and a little bit of this darker fruit component to it as well. I believe that they have a black currant, or they have a darker currant flavor note listed on here, and that makes a lot of sense, as there is this kind of darker berry component to it, but at the same time it's in this very sort of tart, bright, contrasting component to the more weirdly smoky, robust characteristic, and oftentimes caramel, which could have felt like the most dominant characteristic, especially in these earlier days. Day 13, cup continues to act a little strange, as it felt developed on this day, and this is one of the first days where I lowered the temperatures to kind of see if maybe I could tone down a lot of that smokiness, but it continued to feel interestingly more developed on this day. A bit of these roasty characteristics continue to be there despite the fact that it was reduced. Caramel sweetness continues to dominate the cup, but it's tricky, because at this sense I wasn't able to get as much of the contrasting citric components to it. Day 15, much better day, as this coffee at times feels like day and night. It gets really tricky, as it does start out with this sweeter caramel base, but much of the robust qualities are replaced by this unique tart citrus, and it's really hard to elaborate on just how different it is, because it's somewhat more of the brighter Kenyan citric components that you can get, like those really kind of bright tart citric aspects from really enjoyable Kenyan coffees, the Kenyan coffees that I tend to enjoy. This coffee at times reminded me a lot of, well, interestingly enough, more developed Kenyan coffees, however with a wonderful bright candied sweetness at times that was a little bit more citric. slightly sweeter version of the tartness too, so it was much better on this day, and this is when I ramped up the temperatures again, and I'm like, okay, well, this is interesting. I can't really seem to understand how I'm getting more smokiness when I'm toning down the temperatures, however, I'm getting more citric brightness when I'm ramping up the temperatures. It was really strange in that sense, because day 17, the cup continues to focus on this caramel forward cup before cooling off and settling down into that unique tart berry characteristic yet again. The finish is actually a little different, though, from previous experiences, as it's just kind of more difficult to explain the brightness and vibrancy that's coming from that more tart berry. Just a little bit more contrasting, I guess, compared to the darker, robust characteristics in this coffee. Day 19, inconsistencies yet again, as it continues to feel smoky, and this was what was strange, was I've kind of settled on the fact that here it's brewed again at 205, and when I was brewing it lower, 203, 201, 199, I was getting more smokiness from it the lower the temperatures were, and that's been in heavy contrast to almost every coffee that's been a little bit more developed than I've ever experienced. So I can't explain that one. The cup does really seem to cool down, and there is a drastic change once it does cool down, with these smoky aspects kind of being diluted, and you're getting a little bit more of that tart berry citric aspect to the cup. There is a slight smoky burnt popcorn aspect to this cup as well, and I did experience that on a couple of days. This was one of those days. The following day, day 21, another one of those days. As on day 21, another inconsistent day of this coffee, as it yet again has that somewhat roasty components to it. An interesting herbal, subtle component reminiscent of Kenyan coffees yet again. So that's what I keep alluding to, is there were so many things that reminded me of Kenyan coffees within this coffee. However, it obviously wasn't a Kenyan coffee, but people have said a lot of times that Colombian coffees can have pretty similar characteristics to Kenyan coffees in general, and I was definitely experiencing it with this one. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. All right, a bunch of level 4, so let's go through those real quick. The finish at level 4, yeah, you know, it's a little bit on the lower side of that level 4, as I would say that it's a little bit more even than expected. It doesn't have a really bright, lasting acidity to it, which is something that I might have expected. The citrus finishes off kind of even, and the berry vibrancy also finishes off kind of even, so it is on the lower side of the level 4, but I felt it was justified on the day I made this tasting wheel, so yeah, there, but not quite. The berry fruit level 4, yeah, that interestingly on this day has become the most defining characteristic to this cup of coffee, as it's definitely there with the more citric aspect of this coffee. Those two things were in abundance throughout the time drinking it, even if at times they were a little bit more secondary to the more robust smokiness within this coffee. So I feel those were definitely justified at the level 4. Caramel level 4, truth be told, that one could probably be toned down to a level 3 on this day. In the earlier days, it was the first thing you were experiencing from the coffee. Day 7, the first time I tried this coffee, I said, wow, this is really caramel forward for this coffee. But since then, it hasn't been as pronounced, as was a little bit more time. It just skewed a little bit more on the fruity side of things, which honestly for me is better. And we have a bunch of level 3s, so let's see here. The body, level 3. Yeah, interestingly, I expected this to have even more body than it does, but it's kind of in that middle body territory, so I feel like that's justified right there. Cleanliness, level 3, as I've kind of alluded to, there's this smokiness that I feel like really takes away from what would normally be a level 4 for a washed coffee. So while it is clean, when it does cool down, it definitely had that robust smokiness throughout the time drinking it, so I feel like that's what kind of holds it back from reaching that level 4 mark. Acidity, level 3, that's the one I find to be the most interesting, because I fully expected, given just how many Kenyan characteristics there were to this coffee, and that first impression of it having this kind of sharp acidity to it, it never really continued to live up to that really bright acidity, as it was more moderate in general, which is a good thing for me, so it remained at the level 3 mark. Sweetness, level 3, that one's another interesting one. This coffee's so interesting to discuss, because the sweetness was somewhat moderate most of the time, as I think it was just kind of secondary to the, well, bright citrus, bright berry characteristics, as well as robust characteristics, but hidden underneath all of those things, you can see some hidden sweetness that comes out really nice once the cup does cool down. I could justify it at a level 4 mark, however, I think that since it was definitely a more secondary component to a lot of other dominating factors in this coffee, level 3 seems to work best for it. Bitterness and smokiness, those are two things I've been kind of discussing throughout this time, as the smokiness was really interesting. It was always there in this coffee from the first time trying it, and no matter what sort of adjustments I made, it continued to be present in this coffee. So It's interesting, but I know it wasn't my error, as if you just smell the beans themselves, you can smell the same sort of thing coming from the coffee. So I feel like my brewing of this coffee came out exactly the way that this coffee smells, just in the whole beans and definitely in the grounds themselves. So I feel like I did a pretty good job of brewing this coffee. It just came out in this more smoky manner than what I would have expected for this coffee going into it. Bitterness level 3. A couple of things, a little bit of that smoky kind of roasty bitterness, but in addition to that, it was citric. So there was a bright bit of citric bitterness in this coffee as well. We've discussed a lot of components in this tasting wheel, and I think that's all the things worth discussing. As you can see, this tasting wheel doesn't really look like many, if any, other tasting wheels that I've made for any other coffees, because this coffee was just that different in general. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like this review's already gone on a little longer than normal, but it's because I've had so much to discuss about this coffee specifically. It's different. And it's different, I would say, actually in a good way, contrary to the fact that I've alluded to the fact I'm not necessarily a big fan of more roasty tasting coffees. This one right here had such unique and interesting components to contrast that I felt like it was more than justified. That interesting tart berry component that was coming from it in a slightly candied and sweeter sense was really pleasant. The fact that it was moderate on the acidity while at the same time a hidden subtle nice sweetness to the cup made this one a kind of complex drink, and for a cup of coffee or a bag of coffee that comes off maybe not necessarily the most adventurous for black and white, sweet citrus, blackcurrant, caramel, it's definitely did offer a lot more than just those baseline traits. As this tasting wheel is a little all over the place, this coffee's a little all over the place, and I would say that the variety made this coffee quite fun and interesting of a drink. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, it does tend to lean towards your Kenyan drinkers, as it does have so many of those Kenyan characteristics to it. However, keep in mind it does have that interesting smokiness as well, so if you're looking for a more unique, bright, sweeter citrus that comes from coffees, I feel like this one had that in abundance. At times it was really pleasant when you're able to pull that component out as the most dominant characteristic to this coffee. Keep in mind, it was a little tricky to work with, it was a little inconsistent, but at the end of the day, when you're able to get this coffee right, I think it's a very lovely coffee. I think for the most part though, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, we'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Santiago Caro wash process Colombia from Black and White Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.